Welcome back. You know what this must mean. Time for a brand new build. And this one may seem a little familiar because it's going to be inspired by this previous build. So I just really love the look of this little Valkyrie, and I really like the performance. It's just so unique. So I decided to make a companion piece to it. So again, I went with a military theme with kind of this flat tan. So you can see the paint and body work is in progress. So I went with a TS3 dark yellow. So again, that's made for plastic, not Lexan. So I put PS55 flat clear on the inside first, and then followed with this TS3, and then sealed it with a PS5 black. And then I came back, masked the windows on the outside, and that's where we are now, and hit it with PS55 flat clear on the outside. And that basically takes the shine out and brings it down to looking just like TS3 on plastic out of the bottle. So it all matches. So it's a little bit similar, but there are some differences here. So I'll just take you through the parts I've got laid out here. I've got the CC hand mirrors for the C10, the lumber pine interior again. Same CC hand front bumper, but with lights. Some cheapo little dip skids. NZ Hobbies brass trans skid. Mofo RC brass linkage and servo tray. NZ Hobbies brass knuckles. Mofo RC black label servo. I'm trying out some new shocks, at least for me. And this color is pretty sweet. They're black. Most of the time you see them, these are red. So I'm trying one of each. Then I've got Hot Racing high clearance JLU C10 links. Trio front brass diff cover, overdrive. Then I've got an FSBS 6, metal gears, and then a little surprise here, very little. This tiny new brushless motor from Mofo RC is going to go in. So I've got two motor mounts. This was the original, and then he updated it with a new setup like a couple weeks later. Someone hadn't got the new version. So there are going to be some new things on this. It won't be just the same. Oh, I forgot. There's a few other things. There's a whole nother set of wheels. There's a whole nother axle. There's a whole nother servo. So this thing is actually going to be a 6x6. So it'll be a lot different. So there's some more high clearance links. So I can use the deadbolt fronts at the rear. Same setup here, Hot Racing aluminum tray, black label servo. Another set of these shocks for the rear. Some metal drive shaft. These were spares I had. Extra full send weights if I want to use them. I got some more of these RC 4-wheel drive aluminum hexes that fit their wheels so nicely. And then I'm trying out the aluminum flex blades. I think I'm going to use those in the rear on both axles. And then the pass-through worm gear here and the diff cover for that. And then these are the rest of just the Valkyrie kit components. So got this painted up kind of where I want it, similar to this. It's a new style, so it doesn't bolt on to an existing chassis anymore, but it also eliminates the dual motor. The original one had two motors, so it's a lot more complex. So it got rid of that, but it still kind of looks the same on the rear, so I just painted the line, so it'll kind of have that same paint line there, where this one the green, the other one will go tan. So that is the game plan you see laid out in front of you there. So have never built a 6x6, you know, don't really know what I'm doing with this chassis, all these pieces, so I'll just dive in and see. We will learn together, but this ought to be pretty cool, so stay tuned. There's one component, critical component, that I failed to mention that is not visible on the table, and that is the ESC to go with that FSBS6 Black Sky receiver, and that is going to be the new FuryTech Pro Lizard. And I chose that for several reasons, but since this is going to have two Black Label servos steering it, I wanted the larger BEC that this is going to have. This motor already has a pretty long whip on it there. The new Pro has direct plug-in on the board, so there's no soldered on wires coming off you have to plug onto, so that's going to eliminate some wire length. Again, it's going to help it tuck in the build. The board itself may be a little smaller, I'm not sure. And the final thing is I'll be able to run this on 3S as well. So that'll be interesting to be able to see what this will do on 2S and pump it up to 3S as well on this new motor setup. So I'm thinking that should be plenty of power for all these wheels and tires. So, and turning 2 axles as well. So anyways, that has been delayed and delayed, so hopefully that'll be here in a week or so, but I'm not going to let that delay starting this build. It's time to begin, but before we can build this up, we're going to have to tear this down. So it's time to take this tiny truck, this brand new truck, and pull it all apart and set aside everything we're not going to use and figure out what we're going to need. So let's dive in. All right, so this is what's left of the brand new truck. All the parts I'm not going to use. Okay, a quick look at what is actually going forward in the build. I'm going to reuse the black grille on the new body and the lights, the bumper mount, the front axle and inner axles and bearings, pins and the lock nuts. Then the battery tray, I believe, gets reused minus the legs. I think those get cut off. The ESC tray is a mystery, but I know I need the posts to somehow come up and grab the hood, so this may be partially reused. We'll see. Then I've got the transmission case. I'll pull out those plastic gears that are in there when I get to that. So the drive shafts and the case, and then the lock nut for the spur gear. Then in the rear we've got the axle housing and the inners, and no worm gear because I'll put the pass-through gear there. That axle becomes the middle axle. And then I kept the roll bar, the black roll bar. I'm going to reuse that on the body as well. So these are the few pieces that are going to make their way forward. So I guess now we're going to start probably assembling the transmission motor and axles, kind of working towards the chassis assembly. So let's look at what we're going to throw on here. The NZ Hobbies brass knuckles, 7 grams each. The Mofo RC brass steering linkage set. And the Black Label servo, we'll just set it in there for now. Can't center it or hook it up until we get electronics. The Mofo RC adjustable brass servo tray. And this was the kind of newer model with the rounded top servo posts, these plastic ones. They kind of have a different profile than the old ones. But he's got even newer ones now that are aluminum and even thinner. So I have some of those on the way to swap in when they get here to try out. Then the heavy brass diff cover from Trio, I can't remember the weight of this. If it's like 10, 12, I'm not sure. And then of course, as I mentioned, the Trio overdrive worm gear set for the front. So that should get the front axle back together, and we'll move on to what will now be the mid axle shortly. Look at that. Got a fully assembled front axle, nice and weighty. So one thing I forgot to mention was the aluminum hexes. So those are these RC four-wheel drive hexes. So I went ahead and put those on. So now we are jumping over to the rear axle, which is now the middle axle. So I've got the little pass-through worm gear in there, and you can see it's fairly shiny there. I had to sand off each end of the shaft to be able to slide the bearings on there. And so Nick provides sandpaper, so that's, you know, kind of a known thing, but not a big deal. You just kind of sand it down for a second. So the bearing seat, and then this can slide on there with the link carrier, and then it allows the drive shaft to come on through. So this does not seal like watertight, it's flat, so it doesn't have any kind of lip to it. So you can see here that inside edge kind of has a lip, so it could receive kind of a diff cover lip. So when you, hopefully when I tighten this down, there won't be a little gap, but either way, it's not going to be watertight, but that's not a big deal, but it may be to some people. So anyways, I'm going to wrap up this axle, and then we will jump to the rear axle and take a look at that. Alright, well, I was able to get this diff cover seated nicely on there, so there's no gap. Snugged it up, kind of just, you know, worked it around, snugged it up evenly, not too tight, but just till my hand slipped off the tool. But it seems to be functioning great. I did put some waterproof grease in there, and so a little of that squeezed out, so should have a little seal maybe around the perimeter. So that ended up seating on there a lot nicer than it looked on the test fit. So that's the middle axle. So let's see about that rear axle. You're looking at the third and final axle. This will be the rear axle, rear steer. And since it's in the rear, everything's going to be aluminum rather than brass. So I've got these Hot Racing aluminum links that I pulled off another build when I swapped in brass links. Got an aluminum servo tray. I have a ton of these aluminum diff covers pulled off of axles when I've swapped in brass, so might as well dress it up. And then of course I've got the ready to run full axle assembly with bearings and inner axles and everything to use as the basis. And then we'll use 2 more hexes out of these aluminum RC four-wheel drive hexes. Okay, third axle complete. So this is the aluminum rear steer axle. So that looks ready to go. So we'll set that aside, and we're going to work on the midsection. So we've got this 13.8 gram black gold, this brass black coated diff skid. So I've used that before, very good price on that. Probably the cheapest gears I could find on Amazon that were metal. Then I've got a metal spur gear that I pulled out of a prior build. Of course, the plastic transmission case, we're going to reuse that. And then this is the motor mount. This is 1/2 of it, and that's the difference between the new style versus the old. It's basically got a full sidewall to strengthen it and kind of enclose it. And it comes with a 20-tooth transfer pinion rather than a 14-tooth. So a couple of minor differences there, but this is kind of the 2.0 motor mount. So get this together and see if I run into any issues, but this looks pretty straightforward. Quick shot here before I get it all buttoned up here. So you've got to put in the motor before the spur gear as typical, and then put that spur gear on. So I've got it in, and there's really no wiggle room on the motor, so hopefully he's got all the meshing worked out. And then that open hole right there under the gear is where that idler gear is going to go. And then this, basically this cover plate will go on. So that's the last little bit, and then we'll see if it all spins. Okay, not exactly the end result, but we can hook it up for a little test to this Tegu, and let's just see here. Seems to be working. That's going to be a beast on 3S. Alright, so just wanted to make sure, had the gear mesh all good. I mean, you don't really have any way to adjust it. I did have to put a tad bit of Loctite on this silver screw. It actually goes through the transfer pinion and then through the plastic cover, and then it goes back into the motor mount. And it kept wanting to back out on me, and you don't really want to tighten it to compress it because you'll pinch that pinion and it won't spin. So that was the issue. If you don't have it tight, it just vibrates when that pinion spins and it backs out. So a dab of Loctite on that worked. And then these 3 cover screws are not fully, you know, compressing. They're kind of backed off. I initially tightened everything down and it was really tight. So I just kind of worked everything back and, you know, made sure it could rotate by hand. But I just wanted to double check it here, since we will not have an ESC for some time while I wait on that one to come in. But this is a good test, and wow, that on 3S is going to be nuts. So, alright, chassis time. So I've got this laid out on how I assume it basically assembles. The kit comes with some little micro nuts here, I'm assuming maybe to back up shocks if you want to. 6, 8, and 10 millimeter hardware. And then this is the ESC tray, so it's got 2 mount points, 2 holes here. I'm assuming this cross brace is this larger hole. This upper one is for these larger bolts. It's the hinge tray for the body. And you've got another larger hole at the rear. I'm assuming that cross brace. I think these 2 deeper pegs screw in here and here on the inside, and then you mount your upper link and your lower link kind of slot in there, so you get some really long 12 millimeter hardware for these guys. And then you've got the battery tray, the stock battery tray. I need to cut the legs, and then these bigger screws will slot through here on each side and screw into each one of these, and 2 holes on these screw into 2 holes, so that battery is going to ride at an angle, kind of an LCG forward position. Then we've got 1 more crossbar and 1 more hole, and then this may just be an extra, and I'm still not certain how to mount the body posts, so just gonna have to see. Looks like most of the main mount points are recessed to take into account a lot of this thickness, because this is quite a bit thicker than the chassis rail. So otherwise you'd have to have longer screws for everything. So that's kind of a close look at that. And then this piece is that rear mount for the links, and that should screw in, I believe, here with the open slots here and here. So an upper and a lower, those are the only 2 positions that make sense to me. It could potentially be this way with a lower and an upper. So I may check online as well and clarify that before I jump into assembly. But got my links here ready. The JLU C10 high clearance for the front and middle. And then this is the deadbolt high clearance, and I'm just going to use the short uppers for that rear axle. And then I'll get the shocks out, and we'll look at those when I actually get a little further in the assembly and we get to mounting axles. I see some progress. So we've got a completed chassis here, which was not too difficult, little time consuming. I think just due to the 3D printed plastic, you want to pre-thread all of the holes, especially two parts you're going to assemble together. Makes life much easier. Just go ahead and make sure everything threads in cleanly and the holes are opened up and large enough. So other than that, just a few assembly notes here. Before you put the two pieces of frame rail together, you're going to want to start by putting in your link mounts to each side, which you'll mount these two to the frame. And of course, your upper and your lower go down there. You're going to want to mount each of your body post mounts. And there's 2 rows of 3 holes there, and they go in the rearward of the 2 sets. You're going to want to put on each of your battery mount blocks first. And then that's basically it. Then to assemble, start with the transmission. These 2 pegs didn't exactly fit in. I had to kind of open up the hole a little bit to get those to seat. Go really slow with these. Just make sure everything threads in. Don't force anything. ESC tray was next. Braces next. And then the battery tray goes in those slots, and you can move it side to center it. So that is your chassis assembly. Almost got it sitting down right. There we go. So everything else here you see is going to take us up to basically a roller, I guess minus the wheels and tires, you're not seeing. So we've got the internal shocks for the rear axles. Going to pair those with the aluminum flex blades. Then I've got the coilovers for the front axle, and this hodgepodge of metal drive shafts for that rear assembly, which supposedly is a JLU rear female shaft cut a little bit to length. So I'm going to see with those pieces what I've got. I've also got some plastic drive shaft pieces, so I think this will be a good place to get to make sure I don't need to order that piece. And then I've also got my CC hand inner fenders out, just test fitting these. They look like they're going to snake right under the battery tray. This frame doesn't have all the typical mounting holes, but it's got enough key ones, and of course I'm going to cut off the rear portion anyways, so we'll see if this works. It's not critical at this phase yet. I think getting all this together, we'll have a full roller and functioning chassis assembly. I think that's a good stopping point. Let's take a look at these shocks. So you get 2 spring rates. You get a fairly soft, super soft really, and then fairly stiff. So I don't know yet which one I'm going to be running. May just have to see. They give you the built-in spacer type brass ball. So you want to put that spacer towards the inside at the coilover cap. You can see there it's about even with the cap, and then you get a normal ball at the end. And I don't like these type. It doesn't have the larger flange on one side, so these O-rings could potentially pop off pretty easily after you mount it, the outer ones, but we'll see. Another unique thing is they actually have a little nut down here, so you can tighten this against the nut instead of using thread locker. which is the first time I've seen that, I think, on a shock setup. I've had a couple of these unthread on other shocks, so you have to use some thread locker down there, so that's kind of nice. You just put some tension on it when you, it's basically like acts as a lock nut. And then of course it's got the preload collar, but yeah, interesting. We'll see. Definitely a nice looking shot for sure. Look at that. We have a complete roller with 4-wheel steer. Look at that. So I got these rear shocks on. I went ahead and put the soft spring rate in those. My metal drive shaft pieces worked out. I believe I used a JLU front female and then a JLU rear inner, just from the assorted metal shafts I have, but that seems to give me the full droop there and doesn't come close to pulling out. Got the flex blades on the rear axles, and I remembered why I usually don't use them on the steering axle with aftermarket shocks, because the bolt head sticks out so far. You can get into clearance issues when you turn on your links and your knuckle. But luckily this is still plastic knuckles, so those are smaller, and the aluminum flex blades are actually thinner than the plastic, so that also helps. So these barely touch at the bottom. I don't think it's going to be a big deal back here. And then of course on the mid axle, no issue, there's no knuckles or linkage. So rear servo clearance at the frame looks like it gets under on full compression on one side, so I think I'm going to need to chamfer so that I can come on, I can swing back. So I'm going to have to chamfer both of those top ears off as I usually do on the rear. And then the front is awesome. There is no clearance issues at all. The way he's got this frame designed, it comes up so high in the middle, and then the only thing low is the bumper mount. So as long as I still get the clearance once I get the bumper on there, that should be fine, but I don't anticipate having to trim that up at the front. So there is the complete assembly there. So we've got a rolling chassis. So I think that's a good stopping point for stage one. So we've got body work, scale details, bumper, lights, ESC, receiver, all the electronics getting wired in, the inner fenders, if those will work, potentially some alternate wheels and tires. So yeah, there could be some surprises coming up on this build yet, but stay tuned for more on this, and thanks for watching.